online. I'm Tim Laurie and I'll be chairing this session, and I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're standing and working on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We've had a few disruptions to this particular session. So one of our presenters unfortunately has fallen ill, Kawsar, so I'm very sorry and wish her all the best. And then another presenter, Caitie, she might be having difficulty finding the venue, or we're not sure where she is right now. But of course, if she pops in, all the better, and we'll have her after the current presentation. But Guy, you've been very generous by going first, because I realize, we're also admitting someone. You've been very generous by agreeing to go first. It was not the plan. But we're really excited about your paper, and it actually means that we get more time to talk about your topic.
Oh, amazing.
So your topic, which I'm really excited about because I really love your topic. So the title of the paper is Consuming Conflict, VR and Military Entertainment in Contemporary Art. I'll embarrass you a little bit by just reading out your bio as well. So Guy Lobween is a PhD candidate in the School of Creative Practice at QUT. His research focuses on adapting the experimental creative processes of the 1920s avant-garde for art making in game engines and immersive installation. Working extensively with virtual reality technology, immersive multimedia spaces and contemporary art installation, he has exhibited his work both nationally and internationally. Thank you so much for coming along, Guy. Really excited to hear you.
If you have to admit anyone, yeah,
I can sit on an angle and an admitting angle.
Righty. Yeah, before I start, I'd like to also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land from which we stand, as well as the Turrbal and Yagara people of Meanjin, which I'm from, which is Brisbane. And I'd also like to pay respects to their elders, past and present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So, hi, my name is Guy Lobween, and I'm a PhD candidate. Thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction. I work at QUT, Queensland University of Technology. I'd like to thank Hunar for having me here today, and UTS for facilitating this discussion. But I'm going to speak about my previous master's research, which is about VR and military entertainment in contemporary art. And this presentation might have a few images that are distressful for some viewers. So if that's the case, just leave the room, I guess. Close your eyes. So in 2018, on an international art residency in Russia, I took these photographs deep in the forests of Hanhiave National Park, which is located about 3 kilometers into Russia and Finland's water security zone. So this park has been a buffer between the countries since the end of the Second World War. And as such, the objects I found in this forest had been virtually untouched for 80 years. Gas masks, food tins, trenches, and scattered remnants of military vehicles sort of littered the forest floor. So as I wandered this place and surrounded by these historic objects sort of frozen in time, I realized that I'd seen much of this equipment before. I'd seen them in military movies and in video games and in photographs. It was here that I realized none of these aforementioned media really had captured the real presence of these objects and sort of that ghostly feeling that they'd once been used by someone, sort of dropped, discarded, left by a person who was truly experiencing war compared to military entertainment. And so in this way, I've sort of had a very paradoxical relationship with military entertainment. So ranging from military films to first-person shooters and even historical memoirs, military history has always been like a subject that I've been interested in. However, I always feel contradicted in finding the recreations of this conflict entertaining while being utterly repulsed at that real barbarity of war. So there's this real paradox between those two ideas. And sort of interrogating this paradox has been a part of my artistic practice. As a contemporary artist, I use drawing, animation, and virtual reality, or VR for short, to explore the motifs that continuously appear within this media and in this landscape of violence. Through auto-ethnographic inquiry, my practice-led research in my master's aimed to explore this discourse between real combat entertainment, and new VR technology, which is making virtual conflict more and more immersive. So where does this military entertainment come from anyway? As Peter Mantello, J.C. Hertz, and Roger Stahl observe, contemporary military entertainment in largely the West comes from the United States. They're a massive military entertainment complex, connects politics, military, and industry to continuously perpetuate a war-based economy. And while it sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, the Department of Defense in the US openly parades its entertainment unit at the Pentagon. This unit plays an integral part in tying the military with Hollywood and US game-based publishers. So consequently, this has led to a huge subculture of film goers and video gamers who are unconsciously entwined with this geopolitical theater of the US Armed Forces, where they've been and what they've done. And this complex gets larger every year. Like the latest collaboration between the DoD and Hollywood was Top Gun Maverick. And it currently sits at the top of the box office with sales grossing like over 1.4 billion. And while the deal between Paramount Pictures and the DoD for this sequel is like unknown, what we do know is after the 1986 Top Gun released, naval aviator applications increased by 500%. And with US recruitment falling 25% this year, the DoD is constantly looking for ways to fetishize military hardware. And so as such, the DoD facilitates deals with game companies and military industry to portray their weapons in their games. These weapons, of course, appeared in the top 2 selling video games of 2021, Call of Duty Vanguard and Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, selling approximately 50 million copies combined. However, this is on track to be beaten by the latest installment, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which has sold around 16 million copies. However, it only released 19 days ago. So throughout this entertainment complex, young adults, predominantly 16 to 24-year-old males, are subject to like an invisible form of ideological indoctrination through the distribution of commercialized military knowledge. This is because, as suggested by Mantello, US-based publishers are influenced by state and military officials to produce games that predict and solidify future security threats. Here, citizens become an integral part of dominant post-9/11 discourses by learning the equipment and tactics of both their own nation and the proposed ideological enemy of the United States. So as Smicker states, war video games function as increasingly common performative spaces within the domain of everyday life, where one enacts particular images, narratives, and discourses of past or present military violence to purportedly prepare for its repetition. So in playing games such as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, players are thrust into locations that mirror the combat zones in which current or recent US operations have taken place. Many of these dominant games are based around shoot and destroy mechanics, in which solutions to problems in these locations can be easily associated with violence. Tasked with missions like neutralizing terrorist threats, these games seem to clearly perpetuate the simplistic black and white ideology demonstrated by recent US foreign policy. And now this unchecked violence is, it's my bad. This unchecked violence has become synonymous with the ontological discourses surrounding the US and its allies, projecting military assets around the world as a global police force. And as Stahl observes, this rampant power has allowed some sections in the military, such as drone pilots and special forces, to adopt a PlayStation mentality and displaying little regard for international human law. And here in Australia, this has been confirmed by the recent Brereton report, which found 39 accounts of murder perpetrated by our own Special Air Service and armed forces in Afghanistan. It was investigating these realities I began to question how contemporary art could ever subvert or challenge such a socially integrated and complicated media machine. So one artist who successfully navigates this material is Australian artist Baden Palethorpe. His work repurposes military assets from video games to create computer-generated imagery that reflects on the nature of the virtual and the actual. In this work, MQ-9 Reaper 1, a United States Reaper drone is repainted in a reflective chrome and drifts across a barren desert landscape, presumably Afghanistan. The sequence continues till the drone comes to a standoff with a shipping container floating high above the desert, So the container opens to show an operator going about their daily life in a virtual living room. And what Palethorpe offers us in this work is a surreal interaction between the operator and their slave drone that they are seldom to meet. Palethorpe considers what it means for the operator's body and mind to be extended through the mechanical and virtual senses of this military technology. When drone operators enter control rooms in Creech Air Force Base, Nevada, they are teleported through a screen-meditated experience to landscapes of foreign countries. In understanding this reality, Palethorpe asks us to consider how a drone operator could determine life and death responses through images alone. In contemplating Palethorpe's work, I question what difference really exists between the sensory experience of a drone pilot and a 14-year-old controlling a virtual drone in a game like Call of Duty. With today's computational graphics, it could be argued that there is little difference in that experience. But while this simulation of combat is restricted to the screen, VR is not. VR offers audiences the ability to sensorially immerse themselves in the actual operations and movements of war. VR, specifically head-mounted displays like Oculus and HTC Vive, allows players to learn the technical operation of firearms, grenades, and tanks, all with the spatial feedback and real-time physics of the real world. And while VR is still somewhat graphically limited, if tech giants like Meta and Google keep pouring billions into its development, military VR experiences will only get closer to feeling like real combat. So when I found myself in this Russian forest surrounded by the discarded objects of a conflict long past, I couldn't help but feel like absolutely powerless against these forces that actively promote global conflict. How could visual art practice subvert such complexities and turn VR against its own intended purpose as a military simulator? In Paniavi National Park, I was invited by my residency director, Varvara Felixtova, to the village of Vartalampi. It is little more than a field now, as it had been destroyed by an SS division in the Second World War, as they had retreated from the eastern battlefields. A historic center of trade between the north of Russia and Finland, this village had been a key road link between the two countries. So in contemplating the military entertainment complex, I was compelled to use VR as a tool to facilitate a digital reparation of what had been lost in conflict's wake. Virtual Corellia, which viewers experience a VR recreation of the destroyed village, was made with the help from Russian archaeologists and historians from the Paniavi National Park. The village was recreated with modeling programs and Unreal Engine, which is a game engine. The artwork allows audiences to explore the homes and the surrounding landscape using teleportation to move through the different environments around the village. However, there is no emerging story. No interaction is even necessary, though it remains available. Instead, there is gentle sounds of water nearby, the birds in the trees, and an eerie emptiness that speaks to the meta-narrative of the village's historical wartime loss. The experience replicates the feeling of wandering this space and time without the need to gamify the combat that occurred here 80 years ago. As the viewer explores the extents of the village, they can find the same rusty ammunition tins and overgrown combat trenches that I explored years ago. Here they can develop a growing impression of the virtual space in ways similar to the real experience of aimlessly wandering a historical place. And while this provides a reflective and contemplative experience, the fact that the village now only exists digitally is essentially the point of the artwork. It's in the subversion of military entertainment that visual art practice has a unique opportunity in VR to realize experience itself, creating intimate relationships between the viewer and history. Although this is facilitated as well as complicated by virtual reality, the representation of what is lost through conflict couldn't be more apparent. In this way, virtual Corellia is self-reflexive of my experience in Russia and with military entertainment. In its resistance to gamification and deference to place and time, the work comments on the ideological dissonance between the violent military entertainment central to video gaming and the realities of conflict on which that industry trades. And 2 years ago, the proposed iteration of this work was actually accepted by the Zlatia Foundation in Ukraine. This prospective residency was called Zavod 2, which is Factory 2 in Ukrainian. and aimed to recreate Izlatsia's original gallery space in Donetsk, which had been destroyed by the DPR militia in 2014. And now 4 years after the creation of this artwork, and after COVID, that I couldn't go to Ukraine, and the current calamity that is unfolding since the barbaric invasion by the Russian government into Ukraine, I have yet to fully comprehend how visual art and VR can offer any reflection on such immense loss. So for now, I agree with Ukraine, as well as those who are experiencing conflict around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy.
You're welcome.
That was fantastic. Actually, I'm gonna say that here. Thank you so much, Guy. That was fantastic. Did anyone have, we're just going to be moving near the mic so that people on Zoom can also hear. Did anyone have any questions for Guy? We've actually got quite a lot of time, so feel free to ask questions, provide feedback. There's so much there.
Yes.
Something that really stood out to me, you said,
Yeah, Baden-Powell's work, yeah.
I guess kind of line across the barren.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think even it was interesting, but even within kind of but that homogenizing and kind of really rarefying of landscapes of the global south. So
yeah.
I guess, do you see that a lot? I was really interested that even in that space, we're still kind of confirming that colonial narrative.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I know that work was, I think a little bit of context to that work was, it was part of Baden-Powell's PhD, and he'd extensively written about the US and the use of drones as a way to wage war, basically on a global scale, without any boundaries or adherence to the UN's laws. So yeah, I think in the gamified version of that, there exists this plethora of assets that people have created in an attempt to try and homogenize those locations. And like literally, it's really interesting when we talk about like scanning objects from real life and putting them into games, you lose every context to place. And that's really strange that an object could be scanned and it could be an object from Afghanistan, it could be an object from Australia, and then it's put into the context of a war game based in one of those countries. And then you're like, sort of like competing with, well, now this object doesn't have any relation to this actual context. Its context is provided by this military hardware that is shoved on it. So yeah, I think there's a real problem with decontextualization. And that's sort of occurring, I think, across the entire plethora of assets that are on the internet. Like, it seems like now the internet is like a database for objects that have no context, no place, no soul. They're sort of just like sitting there waiting to be turned into a game about whatever someone wants it to be about. And it's quite like concerning because now these objects, you know, don't have the one thing that makes them special. So I think there's a big question there and probably something that I need to talk about, but I think that's for a future paper.
It actually reminds me of, sorry, Tim, I'm going to like, and now I'm done again. It reminds me of when I was doing my research on representation of refugees or of Afghanistan more broadly. Yeah. And I was looking at kind of media representations. And it was really just something that was a bit peripheral to the heart of the thesis, but it really spoke to me because what happens is, you know, especially with really turnarounds, we're constantly looking for those kind of 1 second or one headliner things. The same images keep getting reused. So if you've got a media report on refugees, you're going to see the same few refugee images, usually victims of something, or really, really rarefied, really simplified kind of representations that keep getting reused because there's just not the time to go in and do really nuanced reporting anymore. And it was interesting because it sounds like it's happening here as well, and it's quite pervasive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well.
I got a question, maybe a little bit outside of the frame.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, one warfare was really extended, not just from the field, but also from the internet. What we have been observed in the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, but a lot of resistance from the Ukraine side. And actually, the main force that we see from the internet from Twitter. China is funding war in Taiwan, and domestically there are a lot of digital propaganda artists creating realistic war image that happened in Taiwan, launched by the PLA in China. So I'm curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I sort of left probably untouched in this presentation was this kind of like what place does actually this military entertainment complex, or what kind of responsibility do they hold to the actual unfolding of events? It's weird when I was in Russia in 2018, when none of this had actually happened yet, and the tensions were quite low. I was watching TV with a young Russian kid, and it was Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, and the bad guys in the Crystal Skull is Russians, as is most, US military films. And sort of this question sort of pops up, is like, weirdly, what responsibility does this military entertainment complex to distributing this kind of content without understanding the ramifications of a kid growing up in Russia, seeing them as the enemy in every film, and going, okay, well, I guess that's the other, sort of using that Lacanian Foucault sort of, it's weird. With Ukraine, it seems like everyone has, I don't think that side has been looked at yet. And I don't think anyone's acknowledging this strange thing where in Battlefield 4, they chose to use China, the PLA, as the opposing side. What ramifications does that have in saying we're making a video game, this is our potential enemy? It's actually quite alarming that that's going on, and that if both sides continue to, take that, or sides, I use that term very flexibly, but it just seems like it's not a good thing to do, and it's toxic, and there should be questions raised about the distribution of that kind of media and why they're doing it. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I think that would be answered by Pentagon officials rather than, us.
Thank you. Just I was watching first. Thank you for your presentation. While I was watching it, I couldn't stop thinking about the pedagogical potential of VR to basically to establish connections between the present and the past, because I have been investigating how can we represent the past, how can we understand what happened. And yeah, it was just something that I think it can assist in struggles nowadays that are connected with past atrocities, that can maybe create new ways of representing the past in a more direct, more bodily way. Do you see this pedagogical potential in VR?
Yeah, Brett Levy, who runs the virtual Menjin, I think he also did one for Sydney as well, recreations of Brisbane Menjin before colonialisation, is a really good example of that. So I think VR being used as like a tool to take people away from their reality is kind of that that's where the real potential of VR kind of sits. It's all right. That's it.
Sorry, this is very invasive.
Admit. Yeah, so it's strange when we think about VR, people approaching VR and approaching it with a narrative goal. I mean, there is definitely means to do narrative in VR, but the problem is that VR is not a narrative-based medium. It's an experience-based medium. It's place over time. It's experience over time. It's not a medium in which you can say, look at this and look at this and look at this, like you can on a film. Film's much better at that. Same with theatre is better at producing dialogue that's really engaging and embodying, because you're sitting there listening to them actually talk. VR has its own language, which is really yet to be expanded upon, and it's only just getting its legs now. But a lot of those legs are coming from video games, where there is a narrative, or people think that video game narrative is the way that VR should operate, when actually video games are a screen mediated experience where you're looking at a 2D screen, so it's similar to film. So there's these questions here, whereas if VR is good at experience, what kind of experience is going to be reflective, contemplative? And that's actually really interesting, because it's actually visual art, which is really good at doing those things. Where video games seem to be really good at telling stories and doing interaction, visual art, installation art has been the bread and butter of artists since we started installing, since cave paintings. It's been like, it's literally that kind of, I'm transforming a space into an experience for people to come in and view. And it's artists who I really see as a valuable asset to VR language development, rather than from the aforementioned fields. Yeah, I hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah, my question is around, are there any ethical frameworks that are being used around VR? Because I guess there's this, like, gaming, and then you use it for the education components. Is there anything around ethical frameworks for use of VR?
There is very limited ethical frameworks for VR at the moment. And that's where there's a huge gap in knowledge in VR, because it's such a new medium. And I feel like this is like very similar to the it's like Pandora's box. Like, you're like, oh, let's just open it. Let's see what happens. But yeah, I think going slowly is definitely the way of developing VR as a medium. But unfortunately, Meta, Facebook, Google don't share that kind of mentality. They seem to want to charge into VR and get the Matrix 2.0 up, or 1.0 up as quickly as possible. And it's actually kind of failing, because people are realizing that there are these ethical implications. And then we've been dancing around for so long. Like, it's the question of the virtual and the real, which, Baudrillard and even Plato were like thinking about, like, what do we know as reality and what do we know as virtual? And it's actually quite mixed. So what does that mean? And that question really hasn't even been answered, even after we've had all these discussions. Baudrillard going crazy over the Gulf War, all those things about hyperreality. It hasn't been resolved at all. No one's come up with sort of answer to this problem. What do we deem as virtual? What do we deem as actual? And where does the crossover sit? And what does that mean with the technology like VR, which is going to make those two things so intertwined that it'd be like very difficult to know what kind of experience we should have in those platforms. But that's a huge question for probably not me, probably a philosopher in somewhere. Apart from that, I know there's an age limit on VR, if that's good, 14. That's the start of something. But I've seen it on kids too many times to, be like, well, that's not even helping.
And how are you approaching within your research? Are you taking any consideration? Because I guess there's a part where you're looking at from the the Facebooks and things.
Yeah.
Within academia and the research you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
how are you approaching sort of that ethics framework for that?
So like actually I'm moving away from VR because of that very implication. When I did this project in Russia, I sort of saw that coming forth, and actually I've moved away from VR completely and I'm actually trying to find more democratic and accessible versions of VR. So in my PhD research, I'm actually creating a sort of VR torch, which instead is a VR headset attached to a projector. And then you use that projector to shine around a space and it acts as a torch. But the problem with VR is it's a solo experience. There is multiplayer, but it's very seldom used and quite expensive. People get involved. So I think the idea of it being a more community-based experience would actually help with answering those ethical questions. And I think those ethical questions are only going to be answered by conversations like this and conversations with artists. And yeah, so I've actually moved completely away from it. That's really the reason. Most of my work now involves 360 projection, 360 screens, because at least with that you can approach it with a methodology that's more reflective and more community-based, accessible, and not approaching on that sort of trapped in a headset, confined to an experience, like almost, you're almost stuck in it. I think the main thing is that in my research, I would look at it as being only approaching reflective and contemplating experiences that more involve looking at objects rather than events and experiences. So that's probably one of the ways I'm doing it. But yeah, it's a really good question actually, and should be fleshed out more. Yeah, so thank you.
Just wanted to jump in there. Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to connect what you were just saying about reflection and contemplation to some of the examples of the combat-based games like Call of Duty. And I guess my question is about what type of pleasure and enjoyment people get out of those games, because and how to respond in terms of changing those games. Because it strikes me that there will always be people who want high stress, action-filled games of some sort. They don't need to be combat games, but it does happen that dominates a lot of that market.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what type of changes can you see happening or can you imagine happening in the industry to still cater to that market, but not with those sorts of ideological meanings or those meanings around place.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things you mentioned just in passing, of course, there's media classification initiatives in different countries. So countries just tightening up on what counts as a permissible or not permissible forms of violence.
Mm-hmm.
There have been successful moves to get rid of sexualized violence in some sorts of games, or to change media classification to make sure that fewer people access it. But then, of course, there's also offering people games that still have the same affects or the same types of stress or the same types of intense decision making that people get really obsessed with, but populating with different content. And I guess I'm just curious, what do you see happening in that space? Is there such thing as either a good combat game or a game that is occupying that environment that is not about combat?
Yeah,
I know that's a very big question.
it's a very good question. And it's interesting because it sort of follows in on the question of, is there such thing as anti-war? So a game that uses war as a platform for entertainment automatically becomes it perpetuates that experience of conflict. Even like, I think a lot of people would classify Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now as anti-war films. They're not. They're complicit with the actions of conflict. If you in Jarhead, I think there's a sequence where they're watching Apocalypse Now and cheering on for the helicopters to fire their rockets, and it's like if this is an anti-war film, why is that happening? So the very idea of something being anti-war but using war as a way of entertainment is really paradoxical. And that's, I think, like, even in my research, that paradox comes up because it's like, okay, so anything that uses war as like a basis for entertainment is automatically not anti-war. And it's like, well, then what kind of media can you make that's against war but isn't complicit in the actions of conflict? So yeah, I don't really know if I have the answer as a visual artist to the question of what the mediascape can do. But I think visual artists have that unique opportunity to provide experiences that are reflective and they're more contemplative and don't use violence, like Brett Levy's work with virtual songlines, creating a replication of the Indigenous land around Brisbane. It's just like beautiful, and it's not about conflict at all. It's about knowing what's lost, and I think that's really where the bounds between those games and visual art is. But as like speculation, I think a good thing for those industries to do is not to use real life places and people and events and experiences as entertainment areas. Make their own versions. Those because I think a lot of people would still say that they would love Dune, or like they love Star Wars. They love these other versions of our world, and I think that's a better use of those assets than making your own stories instead of using real life stories as a way of entertaining people. It seems quite problematic to me. I think those actual events and the mixing with our virtual entertainment complex is actually quite a big problem. And it's something that is a huge societal shift rather than someone coming in and being like, you can't make that anymore because it's literally really bad. It's like, So I don't know how that would even take place. I think it's a big one. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It's a huge
question,
but it's a great answer.
All right. Nice.
Does anyone have maybe a final? Oh, look at this.
Sorry, I'm full of words. Just really quickly, I think that's really interesting. You said when you do the 360 and you said it kind of projects what Brisbane or that other.
Yeah, virtual songlines, Brett Levy's. Yeah.
What it used to look like.
Yeah.
Colonization. You said, it's not about conflict. It's not about combat, but I reckon it's inherently about conflict.
It is, yeah.
Right? It's kind of inherently political to say, kind of, this is what we've lost. It's about that erasure that I was referring to.
Yeah.
So I think it's powerful in that way, but no, you're right. Like, it's not about, boom, boom, boom. It's not about valorizing, the person who wins is the person who can kill the most people. Whereas, in this virtual songlines, love that, by the way.
Yeah.
It's about, mourning the product or the product of that conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brett Levy is Gubbi Gubbi, which is actually where I'm originally from. I'm from Sunshine Coast, and that's Gubbi Gubbi lands. So Brett Levy, I think, actually made a version of that for Sydney for the Eora people, but I'm not sure if that was displayed as a 360 immersive experience or not. I can't remember. But yeah, it is absolutely about conflict. But I think it's getting away from the motifs of conflict, which is those actions, which is where actually the problematic area lies. But
it's actually, I love that so much because really what we're doing is we're lifting this lens and putting it there, on the receiving end of that gunfire.
Mm-hmm.
And it's inherently the same situation from a different lens, from the people getting murdered lens, I suppose. So yeah, I think it's virtual songline. It sounds interesting.
Well, thank you so much. And also just thank you for, we realized we asked you a lot of questions, so you've done a lot of work.
Oh, no,
All that you may have reckoned.
I was ready, sort of.
But maybe we just give another round of applause. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you.
And we're going to be, I think we're coming back to sessions, let's see, this takes us to 12:15, and we're going to be coming back to sessions at 1 o'clock. And I think we're going to be back up in these spaces. So have a bit of time for lunch, we can chat and hang out and so on. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.